Yes, here we are. Welcome to Uncorking a Story. I'm your host, Mike Harlan, and today I'm going to share with you some thoughts I have on the importance of finding meaning in life. Now, when I was an undergraduate studying psychology at the University of Connecticut, I had planned to make a career in that field, and my fascination with the subject was ignited by a teacher I had at Stanford/Trinity Catholic High School. His name was Mike Roper, and he was a guidance counselor. Wasn't my guidance counselor, but he was one of our guidance counselors, and he taught psychology to upperclassmen as an elective. And I was fascinated by his course. First of all, the guy was off his rocker. I love the man to death, but he was. You could see where he could need a psychologist, I guess. Anyway, I loved his course, and I was really fascinated by the prospect of pursuing, an understanding of what makes people tick, what makes them do what they do. And I came to understand, that's kind of a narrow definition of the field. It is much broader than that, but I did wind up declaring it as a major during my freshman year of college, and really I wouldn't have done anything differently. Now, studying the field at the undergraduate level, you learn about a lot of famous psychologists. There's the big ones, right? There's Freud, probably the first one anyone's heard about, but yeah, there's a bunch of big guys: Freud, Skinner, John Brodus Watson, father of behaviorism. But one of the ones that I was really fascinated by was a guy named Viktor Frankl. He wasn't a psychologist; he was a neurologist and a psychiatrist. But what was really interesting about him, among other things, was he was a Holocaust survivor. Um, and he wrote a book called "Man's Search for Meaning." He wrote many books, but "Man's Search for Meaning," I could argue, is probably his most famous. And I do think it should be considered required reading, not just for psych students, but literally any human being. Like, everyone should read this book. And it's divided into two parts. And the first part recounts his time in a concentration camp, and the second part is devoted to his, theory of therapy called logotherapy, which involves identifying a purpose in life to feel positive about, and then, immersively imagining that outcome. And this kind of thing has been popularized by motivational speakers. Tony Robbins, I think, would be one of them. But Viktor Frankl believed that, people who survived the atrocities of living in a concentration camp like he did so because they somehow found meaning in what they were going through. And he would go on to state and postulate that it's important to find meaning in three areas in one's life: through work, through love, and through finding courage in the face of danger. And this has been on my mind recently because I'm writing a book in which Frankel's Man's Search for Meaning plays an important role. A character actually receives this book as a gift, and he finds a coded message inside it. But you know what? While researching, and reintroducing myself to Frankel's work, I couldn't help but reflect on people I've interviewed over the years who have found meaning in these three areas. In work, in love, and in finding courage in the face of danger. Now, the very first episode of this show featured an interview I did with my first co-host at the time, Wendy. Love you, Wendy. The interviewee was the guest, I should say, was Father Dave Dwyer, who I met many, many years ago. He actually hosts a radio program called The Busted Halo Show on Sirius XM's The Catholic Channel. And I found myself becoming a nightly listener of that show because, he brought a very humorous and modern approach to Catholicism. And I really felt moved by his organization, Busted Halos, their mission, and I offered to do some pro bono work for them. And it actually developed into a nice friendship I have with Father Dave Dwyer. Anyway, he's got a story about finding meaning in work, and just have a listen to this clip way back from 2012.
So I went back to MTV. They said, they say you can never go home again, but I did. Particularly since my departure for HBO, a lot of people had left in 1989 when I left to go work for a comedy channel at the time. Were leaving MTV to go to this startup, and there was a little kind of bad blood between the two companies. And I was, I think, the 11th or 12th person to kind of defect. And by that time, they were not so happy with that. And so I didn't know if I could go home again. But the same same guy that was there, the same senior vice president said, oh, yeah, come on back. No, or hard feelings and whatnot. So I worked at MTV for a little while. But at that point, I would say career satisfaction was okay. But I think I thought that maybe there's something more. Is this really, I wasn't saying is this all there is, but the kind of stuff that I was really enjoying in my time away from work started to make me think, is this what I want to do with the rest of my life?
Stars of the 80s, the comedians, and you're going home night after night and doing what?
Praying in church.
Praying in church.
Yeah.
Wendy, does that seem like something?
That does not seem like a match at all.
Does not seem like a match.
No.
And here you are in Denver, Colorado, World Youth Day.
Right.
And you decide what?
I decide that I hear a calling from God and that I should continue with what I've been doing in my off hours, maybe with my entire life. So I begin at that point discerning what it might be like to follow a call to the priesthood with my life. I mean, I didn't come home right then and instantly get ordained. It takes longer than that. But I did start a process of really praying about and asking friends and other people that had made similar decisions about, is this what I should do with my life? And in less than a year, I entered into a novitiate, which is the first year of, sort of the seminary track for ordination to Catholic priesthood.
So just to connect the dots there a little bit, if you hadn't been able to figure it out, he worked in the entertainment industry at MTV, worked at HBO, Comedy Central, and he kind of had my dream job, scouting out comedic talent for late night programming. And he left it all behind because he found a greater meaning in something else. And that, of course, was becoming a Catholic priest. And I really love that story. But, I think about it and I think about my early career. And I'll be honest, I struggled finding meaning in my work for a very long time. Now, if you remember from the early part of this interview, I originally planned on making a living in the field of psychology. And I had dreams of getting my PhD and working as a professor and becoming a therapist. And obviously, that just didn't happen. And there's a number of reasons for that. I won't go into them now, but all it is to say is that in the early part of my career, I had a hard time finding something that I was passionate about in the corporate world. I never imagined myself there. I was bored by anything that had to do with numbers, accounting and finance. They were out. Sales would have been a good choice, but the only sales opportunities I could find at the time were insurance related, and don't get me started on what I think about insurance salesmen. It was only after slogging in a job as a research manager that I came, across what focus groups were. And then my eyes were kind of opened, I had no idea that a person could walk into a room full of strangers and then lead a discussion around a product and then write a report about it, and get paid to do it. I made it my mission, to get trained in that area, and I eventually made a good living by doing it. And, but more important than the money I was earning at the time, it was the fact that I found meaning in the work. For me, it just wasn't about running a research project or focus groups, to test out some new idea or ad. It was about making connections with people and then turning their feedback into some kind of human-centered insight that my clients could use to make decisions. So I was very happy that I could find meaning in work at some point in time in my career. Now, beyond work, Frankl says that we have to find meaning in love, or we can find meaning in love. I don't think he's commanding us. He's kind of directing us, right? And a couple of years ago, I was actually honored to interview a psychologist and author and as well as sort of, trainer, Gay Hendricks, who had, written a book he was promoting at the time. And we actually got into the topic of love because it is something that he knows something about. And I think you should pay close attention to him because, he's been on Oprah, but listen to what he has to say. He's got a story about finding his wife.
Well, I think it's because I'm a classic example of a wounded healer in the sense that I took a lot of things. I never saw any healthy relationships when I was growing up, so I put a priority on creating one once I kind of began to awaken in my early 30s. And like I said, I spent a lot of my 20s just blindly going about unconsciously repeating patterns. And so fortunately, I had a wake-up moment in when I was, it was December 1979, where I had this vision of what I really wanted in a close relationship. And it was three things. I wanted to be with a woman who was absolutely honest so that we could be absolutely honest with each other, never any artifice. Number two, I wanted to be with a woman who was willing to take responsibility for things that came up rather than going for the victim position, because I just started doing that myself. I quit being the victim and started taking responsibility and claiming, here's why I created that in my life. And so I wanted somebody who was getting good at doing that too. And the third thing is I wanted somebody that was really committed to their creative process. The reason is because I go in a room for a couple hours a day by myself and write, and I want to be with somebody who really respects and honors and has that kind of thing going, whether it's writing a symphony or making a soup or whatever it is, that they've got something they're passionately engaged with. So those are my three big requirements. And so I kind of made this prayer to the universe where I said what I wanted, and then I put a clincher on it. And I said, if it's not in the cards for me to have something like that, I'm willing to be alone, but I promise you I'll never settle for less. I kind of cracked the whip on the universe and said, this is what I want, and I'll never settle for less. So a month later, I walk into a room, and there's this amazing-looking human being, and I find out her name is Kathleen. Now we call her Katie. But I persuaded her to move to Colorado with me, and the rest is 3 or 4 books about it and lots of trips around the world. As a matter of fact, right now she's just beginning a relationship seminar that she's teaching over in near Munich, Germany.
Yeah, I think that he had a very clear picture of what he was looking for in a partner, and of course he was in his 30s and had a lot of life experience behind him at the time, and I certainly didn't have that. I mean, I met the woman who would become my wife when I was 18 years old, and we've been together, if you do the math, 31 years, or close to 30 years. I told you before I'm bad at math. So it's almost 30 years, almost 3 decades. We haven't been married that entire time, but nevertheless, it's a long time. And, Frankl was right. I found meaning in love, and it's the love between me and my wife, that led to our 3 children. And I found a tremendous amount of meaning in being their father and playing that role. It's really one of the greatest joys of my life. And, now that they're adults, I kind of miss, that kind of playing a different role for them. When they were younger, I played a different role for them, and now I'm kind of an ATM machine. But all this is to say that, my love with my wife brought me meaning in that way. It brought me to becoming a father. But there were other ways, that the love my wife and I have together, brought meaning to my life. And I think anyone who's been in a relationship with somebody for close to 3 decades will know that it's not always roses. You are going to hurt each other somehow. Sometimes it's going to be in small ways, and sometimes it's going to be in big ways. But what really matters isn't that you hurt somebody or that somebody hurt you. What I think matters is what you do about it. Do you fight for each other, or do you throw in the towel? Do you address the issues in your relationship dynamic, or do you ignore them and just hope that things change? And I'll tell you right now, they won't change unless you force, some, I don't want to say conflict, but unless you challenge the dynamic, what's been leading you into conflict. And so finding meaning in the emotion of love, is of course important, but also challenging yourself and your partner to continue to grow is also important. And I think that kind of ties back to finding meaning in love. And I think also there's a humility that comes with it. You literally have to bare yourself naked to your partner. And I don't just mean physically, although that can be fun. What I mean is like this emotional nakedness that you have to have. And that's something I'll be honest, it's something I've struggled with over the years. I have a very hard time voicing what I want and what I need in my wife as a partner. And many times for years I would sweep things under the rug, and I've learned that doesn't work long term. Master of the obvious comment there. But I have to say that I have found meaning in love through being able to speak up for myself and finding my voice in the relationship. So yeah, there you have it. Enough about love. Um, Lastly, right? Last thing Frankl talks about is that we can find meaning by finding courage in the face of danger. And late last year, I had the pleasure of speaking with Emmy award-winning filmmaker and executive director of the Invisible Disabilities Association, Jess Stainbrook, who shared with me a story that I'll never forget. I don't think you will either. Have a listen.
My company was invited to shoot the first ever inside communist Russia international athletic event. Besides the Olympics, which we didn't go to in 1980, and a lot of my soccer buddies were let down for that. Yeah, we're still angry. But so this was an ultra marathon. And so athlete teams from all over the world were going to come in and run 1,000 miles across Siberia in 15 days. And the long story is actually pretty hilarious, but the short story is that in the midst of that, my company was chosen to cover this for the world, if you will. And they only let 2 of us come with cameras into communist Russia. They gave us a big list of things of what we weren't allowed to do, which was pretty much everything. And as a documentary filmmaker, I mean, I have 8 Emmys in documentary work. This is what I do, and I don't not shoot things, you know what I mean? I shoot everything, and I interview everybody. Well, it was very difficult, but what we found is that there were 4 members of the Russian team that just didn't seem like athletes, or at least that type of athletes. Ultramarathoners usually have a very specific thin look, and it's the way they are. Well, it turns out these guys were KGB, assigned to the race to watch us because they thought we were CIA. And about halfway in the race, I was taken by them to visit for a while because they needed to see whether I was a spy or not. And in the midst of those kinds of traumatic incidences, if you will, I think sometimes you make decisions of, what do I do? You know, and it's that foxhole moment of, if there's a God and he actually exists, and you reach out, might he choose to save you? You know what I mean? And I actually did, and he did. And it so hugely impacted my life that it changed everything.
Now, for context, the story he just told happened in the early 1980s. And, he was going into a country that was technically at war, albeit it was a Cold War, but at war with the United States. And of course, if you watched any movies, any action movies at the time, the Russians were our enemies, and he had to have courage just to get on that plane. But my God, when he was questioned by the KGB, their secret intelligence service, these were not known as nice gentlemen. These were not gentlemen of leisure. I can't imagine the fear that was kind of running through his veins. So much so that in a moment of desperation, he actually said a prayer, and that prayer wound up changing his life. Now, the most courageous thing I had done up until my 20s was maybe drive from Connecticut to the redneck Riviera of Panama City, Florida, with 5 other guys in a 1994 Cadillac Fleetwood. And if you don't think that took courage, well, you never met the guys that I went with. Animals. But kidding aside, I think we all exhibit courage in different ways. And one of the ways that I've done this, that I think I do this, is by staying calm under pressure. So back in 2016, in December of 2016, I was told over the telephone by my boss that my employment status was a lever he had to pull. And that's just a nice way of saying that he was letting me go. It was 3 weeks before Christmas, and I was kind of, blindsided by it. But talk about a dehumanizing experience. You're just a lever I have to pull. I mean, I still get angry about it to this day. But ever since I was married, I've been the sole breadwinner of the family, and I had 3 kids at the time. And this was going back, a little over 4 years ago, and they were freshmen in high school. And I got to tell you, there's not a lot of jobs out there for 40-plus-year-old men in the qualitative research field. You really have to blaze your own path. And I'll tell you, I'll be honest, I was scared, but deep down inside, I knew that I had to appear, strong and confident to my wife, to my family. So, I hit the pavement. I reached out to some old clients. I secured some freelance work. And, I think it took some courage to do that. I was kind of, as Van Halen would say, playing alive without a net. That's a, callback to the old 5150 days. But, another way that I think that I've exhibited courage is, when my triplets were born. They were born 9 weeks premature. My son was 2 pounds, 9 ounces when he was born. That's like lighter than a 2-liter bottle of Mountain Dew. I was to say I was scared shitless was an understatement. I was scared because I was a father for the first time, a father of, I went from 0 to 3 kids in 3 minutes. I was only 27 years old, and these kids, they weren't healthy. They spent the first month of their life in the neonatal intensive care unit, and I went to work, every day, trying to have a smiling face, and at the time I worked for a company called Mastercard, and they did not have paid leave for fathers at the time. I was so junior, I only had 2 weeks of vacation, and I had to use one of those weeks after the kids were born, and because my wife had a C-section, emergency C-section, and I had to help her, and then I took a week of vacation after they came home, and I remember that period of time, and I think Frankel was wrong. I think he missed an opportunity for meaning. Maybe there's an opportunity to find meaning in the face of assholery, because I remember at the time my boss called me into her cubicle, and yes, I was that junior that even my boss had a cubicle, and she came to talk to me because she was worried about my performance, and I'm like, lady, I've got 3 kids. They're clinging to life on ventilators. I'm not sleeping at all. And you can't show me why. You can't show me any empathy. If you need to understand why, you know. But she wasn't a mother at the time, and I did hear after she actually had her first kid, she regretted how she treated me. But anyway, I digress. I digress. So here I am, right? I'm 46 years old now, and I'm looking back on the first half of my life, and I realize that up until this point, my life has actually had a tremendous amount of meaning. And my question for you is, what about yours? Do you find meaning in life? Do you find meaning in your work? And if you have a hard time finding something, meaningful about what you do for a living, I'm not suggesting that you quit your job and follow a passion, because that would be irresponsible. But maybe take some time to reflect on what you would find meaning doing, and maybe search for a way to build that into your job description. Or, maybe it's time to invest some time in training for a career change. One day, if it's feasible for me, I definitely want to go back and pursue that PhD that I put on hold, over 20 years ago. So, secondly, have you found the love of your life? And if you have, are you still getting along? Has it been too close for comfort for you during this pandemic? Loving like pimping ain't easy, but remember, nothing worthwhile is ever easy. So if you're constantly at odds with your partner, if there's something in your dynamic that needs work, address it. It's going to be uncomfortable, but it has to be done. And if you haven't found that person yet, don't lose hope. I do believe that there's someone out there for everyone. Well, I'm no love guru like Mike Myers, but Mariska Hagate, as they say. Now, lastly, most of us are probably not in very dangerous situations all that often, but if we define danger more broadly as a condition that can impact us negatively, we might be able to relate to it a little bit better. So when I was scared and I lost my job, and after my kids were born, I found the courage to keep on going, and to have some kind of yeah, I don't want to call it a happy face, but calmness under pressure, perhaps. And I think I can chalk a lot of that up to, my own faith, which is something I know I don't talk about that often, but it's there. But also having a good support network, you know, and I think that's critical. So I'll ask you a question that I asked a few episodes ago, which was, when you face danger, when you face challenges, who's in your corner? Who can you lean on for help? Frankel never said that you had to go through, danger alone. So, as always, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncorking a Story. And if you like what you heard, please consider subscribing on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you can, if you have a moment, give us a rating and a review. We'd really appreciate that. And of course, if you liked what you heard, please consider sharing Uncorking a Story with a friend, because that's a great way that we can spread the Uncorking a Story message to more people. So, for all the hardworking folks here on Uncorking a Story, this is Mike Carlin saying thank you for listening, and we'll be back on Monday with another episode.